"Sir, can I just sit in the corner? I promise I won't make a sound." The words were so soft they barely seemed real, yet somehow they cut through the quiet hum of the Grand Regent Hotel like a thread pulled too tight. Conversation slowed, silverware paused mid-air, and for a brief moment, the polished marble lobby felt like it was holding its breath. She stood just inside the revolving door, small against the towering glass walls, her dark braids tied with faded blue ribbons, her hands gripping the strap of a worn canvas bag that looked older than she was. Lila Brooks was no taller than the front desk counter, her sneakers scuffed, her jacket too thin for the chilly November air that slipped in every time the doors turned. The concierge blinked first, stepping forward with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Sweetheart, you can't just," he began, his voice polite but firm, already reaching for the invisible line that separated guests from everyone else. But before he could finish, another voice, calm, low, and used to being heard, cut gently across the space. "Let her sit." Daniel Whitmore didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Standing near the elevators, phone still in his hand, he looked toward the girl with a quiet intensity that made people around him straighten without knowing why. At 45, with a reputation built on precision and control, he was not a man who interrupted his own schedule for anything unexpected. Yet here he was, watching a child who had asked for nothing more than a corner. The concierge hesitated, glancing between the billionaire and the girl, then stepped back with a slight nod. Lila didn't smile. She didn't thank anyone. She simply walked, carefully, almost counting her steps, toward the farthest corner of the lobby, a narrow space between a tall indoor plant and a velvet armchair that no one ever used. It was the kind of place designed to be invisible. She lowered herself onto the floor, back straight, knees pulled in slightly, her bag resting neatly on her lap. Then she went still. Not the restless stillness of a child told to behave, but something else entirely. Something practiced. Something deliberate. Minutes passed. Then more. The lobby returned to its rhythm. Heels clicking, voices blending, the distant chime of elevators opening and closing. But Daniel found himself glancing back again and again. She didn't move. Not to look around. Not to fidget. Not even when a waiter passed with a tray of steaming coffee that filled the air with warmth. It was as if she had made a promise not just to the room, but to herself. At 9:17 p.m., Daniel finished his last call. At 9:42, he signed off on a deal that would make headlines by morning. By 10:05, the lobby had thinned, the lights dimmed just enough to soften the edges of everything. And still, she hadn't moved. He told himself it wasn't his concern. Children wandered in cities. Staff would handle it. Systems existed for a reason. Yet when he stepped into the elevator, his reflection staring back at him in the mirrored walls, something felt off. The silence she carried lingered in his chest in a way numbers never did. On the 32nd floor, inside a suite that overlooked the entire city, Daniel Whitmore stood by the window, tie loosened, the skyline stretching endlessly beneath him. He had built his life on solving problems, on anticipating outcomes, on never leaving loose ends. But that night, as the clock ticked past 11:30, then midnight, sleep refused to come. Because somewhere, in a quiet corner of his own building, a little girl had asked for nothing, and somehow, that was the one thing he couldn't ignore. At 12:12 a.m., Daniel Whitmore was still awake. The city below his suite had softened into a quiet grid of amber lights and distant motion, but his mind refused to settle into the neat compartments it usually obeyed. He had reviewed contracts, answered late messages, even turned on the television without really seeing it. Yet the image remained the same. A small girl sitting perfectly still in a forgotten corner, as if the world had asked her to disappear, and she had agreed. By 12:28, he exhaled sharply, grabbed his coat from the back of the chair, and stepped out. The elevator ride down felt longer than usual, each floor lighting up in slow succession, his reflection staring back at him again. Only this time, there was something unfamiliar in his expression, something unsettled. When the doors opened to the lobby, the space had changed. The marble floors reflected softer lighting now, the late-night staff moved more quietly, and the distant murmur of conversation had thinned to almost nothing. But she was still there, in the same corner, in the same position. Lila Brooks sat exactly as she had before, back straight, hands folded gently over the strap of her bag, her small shoulders rising and falling with slow, controlled breaths. For a moment, Daniel did not move. He simply watched, as if afraid that stepping closer might break whatever fragile balance she had created around herself. Then he walked toward her, his footsteps muted against the polished floor. She noticed him when he was about 6 feet away. Not by looking up quickly, not by flinching, but by a subtle shift in her posture, a slight tightening of her fingers around the canvas strap, like someone preparing without making it obvious. He stopped a few feet in front of her, lowering himself just enough so his presence did not tower over her. "You have been sitting here for a long time," he said, his voice quieter than it had ever been in a boardroom. Lila nodded once. Not a word, just a small, deliberate movement. He glanced at the empty chair beside her, then back at her face. "Are you waiting for someone?" he asked. This time, there was a pause. Not confusion, not hesitation exactly, but something like careful thinking. "Yes, sir," she said finally, her voice soft but steady. "My mom." The answer hung there, simple and complete, yet something in the way she said it made the space between them feel heavier. Daniel looked around the lobby, then back toward the entrance, the revolving doors now moving only occasionally as the night deepened. "Do you know when she is coming back?" he asked. Lila's fingers tightened slightly on the strap. She shook her head once, just as small as before. "She told me to stay somewhere quiet," she said. "Somewhere I would not get in trouble." Daniel felt something shift in his chest, subtle but undeniable. He glanced down at the bag resting on her lap. The fabric was worn thin at the edges, the zipper slightly crooked, the kind of bag that had been used carefully for a long time. "What is in there?" he asked gently. Lila looked down at it, then back up at him, her eyes steady in a way that did not match her age. "Important things," she said. "No fear. No defensiveness. Just a quiet boundary." He nodded slowly, respecting it without fully understanding why. A draft of cold air slipped through the lobby as the doors turned again, and for the first time, he noticed the way her shoulders reacted, not dramatically, just a slight tightening, a subtle brace against the chill. "Are you cold?" he asked. Lila shook her head quickly this time, almost instinctively. "I am okay," she said. She had said before. Daniel looked at her, really looked this time, at the way her shoulders held steady, at the way her hands stayed folded, as if even reaching for the spoon might be too much. "Eating does not make noise," he said, softer now. Lila hesitated. Her fingers shifted slightly against the strap of her bag, a small movement, but the first real one he had seen since he returned. Slowly, carefully, she reached toward the tray, as if the space around it might disappear if she moved too quickly. She picked up the spoon with both hands at first, then adjusted, bringing it to her lips with deliberate care. No clatter, no rush, just quiet. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest, not discomfort, not confusion, but something closer to recognition of a rule he had never needed to follow. He pulled the nearby chair slightly closer, but did not sit fully, resting one hand against the back as he watched her take another small bite. "How long have you been waiting?" he asked after a moment. Lila swallowed before answering. "Since it got dark," she said. Daniel glanced toward the glass doors again. It had been hours. More than hours. "And before that?" he asked. Lila's gaze dropped to her bag. This time, the pause was longer. "We were at the hospital," she said finally. The word lingered between them, quiet but significant. Daniel straightened slightly. "Is your mother there now?" he asked. Lila nodded once, then shook her head halfway through, as if the answer was not as simple as the question. "She told me to wait somewhere nice," she said. "Somewhere I would not get in trouble." Daniel's eyes moved back to the bag again. The zipper was not fully closed now, just enough for a thin edge of paper to show beneath the fabric. He did not reach for it. He did not ask her to open it. But he saw it. And something about that single detail made the situation feel less like waiting and more like holding on to instructions that might already be outdated. Lila took another small bite, then carefully set the spoon down exactly where it had been, aligning it with the edge of the bowl as if returning it to its original place. She folded her hands again immediately after. The food remained half finished. Daniel noticed. "That too. You can have more," he said quietly. Lila shook her head. "I should save it," she said, "in case it takes longer." The simplicity of that logic, the quiet planning behind it, settled into the space like a truth no one had spoken out loud. Daniel looked at the tray, then back at her, then at the corner she had chosen so carefully. And in that moment, he realized something else. She was not just waiting for her mother. She was preparing for the possibility that waiting might be the only thing she had. The lobby had grown quieter by 1:18 a.m., the kind of silence that did not come from emptiness but from everything settling into place for the night. Lights dimmed just enough to soften the marble, footsteps reduced to occasional echoes, and the city outside pressing gently against the glass like a distant memory. Daniel Whitmore remained near the corner, no longer standing above the moment, but part of it now, one hand resting lightly on the back of the chair, as if he had forgotten why he had not sat down yet. Lila Brooks had finished only half of the soup, the spoon placed back exactly where it had been, the napkin folded with careful precision beside the bowl. Her hands were back on her bag again, fingers resting over the worn fabric as if it anchored her to something steady. Daniel looked at the tray, then back at her. "You can take it with you if you want," he said quietly. "There is no rule about finishing it here." Lila glanced at the tray, then at him, her eyes steady but thoughtful. "Thank you, sir," she said, and this time she reached for the small roll, wrapping it carefully in the napkin before placing it inside her bag, adjusting it so it would not be crushed. The movement was simple, but it carried intention, planning, and a quiet understanding of what mattered later, not just now. Daniel watched the way she did it, the way nothing was wasted, not time, not motion, not even a piece of bread. "Lila," he said after a moment, trying her name for the first time. She looked up slightly, not startled, just acknowledging. "Would you like to sit in a chair instead of the floor?" he asked. She glanced at the empty velvet chair beside her, then back at the corner, then at her hands. "This is okay," she said softly. "I chose this spot." The answer was not refusal. It was ownership. Daniel nodded once, understanding more than he expected to. He shifted his weight and finally pulled the chair closer, lowering himself into it, not across from her like an authority, but beside her, angled just enough so they shared the same space without closing it. The difference was subtle, but it changed something in the air. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The quiet was not awkward. It was deliberate, like a pause that both of them understood without needing to explain. Daniel looked toward the front doors again, then back at her. "Which hospital were you at?" he asked gently. Lila's fingers tightened slightly on her bag, not in fear, but in thought. "St. Mary's," she said. The name landed clearly, familiar enough for him to recognize immediately. It was less than 3 miles away, a 10-minute drive at this hour. Close enough that waiting here made sense. Close enough that something about the waiting felt more urgent. "Did someone tell you to come here?" he asked. Lila shook her head. "My mom said find somewhere nice," she replied. "Somewhere people would not get mad." Daniel's gaze shifted slowly across the lobby, the polished floors, the quiet staff, the careful distance people kept even in a place like this. He understood what she meant, not just the words, but the calculation behind them. Nice meant safe. Nice meant less chance of being told to leave. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, lowering himself further into her line of sight without forcing it. "Lila," he said, his voice softer than before. "Has anyone come to get you yet?" She shook her head once. The answer was simple, but it carried weight now. He glanced again at the partially open zipper of her bag, at the thin edge of paper still visible inside, then back at her face. "Would it be all right if I helped you check on your mom?" he asked carefully. The question did not rush. It did not assume. It waited, just like she had been waiting. Lila did not answer immediately. Her eyes moved to the doors, then to the floor, then back to him. For the first time, there was something different in her expression, not fear, not doubt, but the beginning of a decision she had not planned to make. "I am supposed to stay," she said quietly. Daniel nodded, respecting it. "And we can," he replied. "But sometimes staying also means making sure the person you are waiting for is okay." The words settled between them, gentle but firm, like a new idea being placed beside an old instruction. Lila looked down at her hands again, then slowly, carefully, she adjusted the strap of her bag, holding it a little tighter, as if preparing for something she had not expected. And for the first time since he had seen her, she shifted her position, just a few inches, but enough to show that the stillness she had built around herself might finally be ready to move. The moment Lila shifted, even just a few inches, the corner no longer felt like a place meant to disappear. It felt like a place that had been holding its breath, waiting for permission to change. Daniel Whitmore noticed it immediately, not because it was dramatic, but because it was not. A small adjustment, a quiet decision, the kind that did not draw attention unless someone was already paying close enough attention to see it. He stood slowly, careful not to rush the space between them, and extended his hand, not as a command, not as an expectation, but as an option. "We can go together," he said, his voice steady, calm in a way that did not press. Lila looked at his hand, then at his face, her eyes searching for something she could not quite name, but seemed to recognize anyway. For a second, she did not move. Then, with the same deliberate care she had used for everything else, she placed her small hand in his. It was light, barely resting there, as if she was prepared to pull back at any moment. Daniel did not tighten his grip. He simply matched her stillness, letting the contact exist without claiming it. Together, they stood. The shift was quiet, but it changed everything. The corner was no longer hers alone. It was something they were leaving behind. As they walked across the lobby, the night clerk straightened slightly, watching with a subtle curiosity that remained unspoken. The revolving doors turned once, slowly, letting in a breath of cool November air that brushed against them as they stepped outside. The city at that hour was different. Not empty, but softened. Streetlights cast long reflections across the pavement, and the distant sound of traffic moved like a low hum beneath everything else. Daniel guided her toward a black sedan waiting near the curb, its engine idling quietly. The driver stepped out immediately, opening the rear door without a word, his movements practiced, respectful, but his eyes flicked briefly toward the small figure beside Daniel. "St. Mary's," Daniel said simply. The driver nodded. Lila hesitated at the open door, not in fear, but in awareness. The car was clean, polished, the kind of space that did not belong to her world. She looked down at her shoes, then at the seat, then back at Daniel. "It is okay," he said gently. "You are not going to get in trouble." The words mattered. She stepped in carefully, placing her feet together as if making sure she left no trace behind. Daniel followed, closing the door softly behind them. The car moved smoothly into the street, merging into the quiet flow of late-night traffic. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Lila sat with her hands folded over her bag again, the strap wrapped twice around her fingers now, tighter than before, but not tense, more like a way of holding on to something steady as everything else began to move. The city passed by in soft blurs of light and shadow, storefronts closed, windows dark, the occasional late-night diner glowing like a small island in the distance. Daniel glanced at her once, then back out the window. "How long were you at the hospital?" he asked after a moment. Lila shifted slightly, not pulling away, just adjusting as if finding the right place for the answer. "All day," she said. "Since the morning." The timeline settled into place in his mind, hours layered quietly on top of each other, leading to that corner in the lobby. "Did someone speak to you before you left?" he asked. Lila nodded once. "A lady," she said. "She told my mom to rest." Daniel's gaze sharpened slightly, but his voice remained even. "And your mom?" Lila looked down at her bag again, her fingers brushing the edge of the zipper where the paper was tucked inside. "She told me to find somewhere nice," she repeated softly. The car turned onto a quieter street, the hospital now only a few blocks ahead, its exterior lights glowing steady against the dark sky. Daniel felt something shift again, not uncertainty this time, but clarity forming slowly, piece by piece. He did not rush it. He did not interrupt it. He simply let the moment continue, knowing that whatever they were about to find was already waiting for them, just like she had been. And beside him, Lila Brooks sat perfectly still once more, not because she was trying to disappear, but because she was holding herself together, one quiet breath at a time, as the place she had been told to wait was finally left behind. The car slowed as the glowing sign of St. Mary's Hospital came into full view, its white letters steady against the dark sky, the building itself rising like a quiet anchor in the middle of the sleeping city. The entrance doors opened and closed in soft intervals, automatic and indifferent, as if they had done so 1,000 times without noticing who came through them. Daniel Whitmore stepped out first, the cool air brushing against his face, then turned back toward the car, offering his hand again, without a word. Lila Brooks looked at it for only a second this time before placing her hand in his, her fingers still light, still ready, but no longer hesitant. Together, they walked toward the entrance. Inside, the hospital felt different from the hotel, not quieter, but heavier, filled with the low hum of machines, distant footsteps, and voices that stayed just above a whisper. The fluorescent lights cast a steady glow over everything, revealing more than they softened. Lila's eyes moved across the space slowly, taking in the chairs, the desk, the people sitting with folded hands or tired expressions, but she did not stop. She walked as if she already knew where she had been earlier, even if she was not sure where she needed to go now. Daniel guided her toward the reception desk, where a middle-aged nurse looked up from her computer, her expression shifting from routine to curiosity as she noticed the pair. "Good evening," Daniel said, his tone calm but direct. "We are trying to find a patient. She was admitted earlier today." The nurse nodded, already reaching for her keyboard. "Name?" she asked. Daniel glanced down at Lila. Lila adjusted the strap of her bag slightly, then spoke. "Monica Brooks," she said softly. The nurse typed, her eyes scanning the screen as seconds stretched quietly between them. Then her expression changed, not dramatically, but enough for Daniel to notice. A pause, a breath, a slight narrowing of her eyes as she read something more carefully. "And you are?" the nurse asked, looking at Lila now, her tone gentler. "I am her daughter," Lila replied, her voice steady, unchanged. The nurse nodded slowly, then looked back at the screen. "One moment," she said, her fingers moving again, this time slower, more deliberate. Daniel felt the shift immediately. Not alarm, not urgency, but something that required confirmation. He rested his hand lightly against the counter, not pressing, just grounding himself in the moment. Lila stood beside him, her posture straight, her hands back on her bag, the strap wrapped around her fingers again as if it held more than just fabric. After a few seconds, the nurse looked up. "She is still here," she said, her voice careful, measured. "But she has been moved to a different unit." Lila's fingers tightened slightly. Not fear, not panic, just a quiet reaction to information she was trying to place. "Can we see her?" Daniel asked. The nurse hesitated, just for a second. "I will need to check with the attending physician," she said. "Please have a seat." She gestured toward a row of chairs nearby. Daniel nodded, then looked down at Lila. "We will wait," he said. Lila nodded once, then walked toward the chairs, choosing the one at the end, closest to the wall, closest to a corner that mirrored the one she had chosen before. She sat the same way, back straight, hands folded, bag resting on her lap. The environment had changed, but her stillness had not. Daniel sat beside her this time, not across, not standing, but present in the same line of space. The seconds stretched into minutes. A clock ticked softly somewhere behind the desk. A cart rolled past, wheels humming quietly against the floor. Lila's gaze remained forward, but her fingers moved once, just once, brushing the edge of the zipper on her bag, as if reminding herself that what was inside still existed. Daniel followed the motion with his eyes, then looked back toward the desk. Something was forming now, not from what had been said, but from what had not been said. The nurse returned after a few minutes, her steps measured, her expression composed. She stopped in front of them, looking first at Daniel, then at Lila. "The doctor will come speak with you," she said gently. The words settled into the space with a quiet weight. Daniel nodded once. Lila did not move. She simply held her bag a little closer, her small frame steady, her breathing even, as if she had already prepared herself for this part, even if she did not yet know what it would ask of her. And in that moment, Daniel realized something else. The waiting had not ended when they left the hotel. It had only changed shape. The minutes stretched quietly, each one marked by the soft ticking of the clock and the distant rhythm of hospital life continuing just beyond the waiting area. Lila Brooks sat exactly as she had before, her back straight, her hands folded carefully over her bag, her small frame still in a way that no child should have to learn. Daniel Whitmore sat beside her, not speaking, not interrupting the silence, but no longer separate from it. He could feel the weight of the moment building, not through noise or urgency, but through the absence of both. Then footsteps approached. Measured, steady, not rushed. A man in a white coat appeared from the hallway, his expression composed but thoughtful, the kind of expression shaped by years of delivering information that never landed lightly. He stopped a few feet in front of them, his gaze first meeting Daniel's, then lowering gently to Lila. "Are you here for Monica Brooks?" he asked, his voice calm, careful. Lila looked up at him, her eyes steady, her answer immediate. "Yes, sir." The doctor nodded once, then pulled a small tablet closer to his chest, as if organizing his thoughts before speaking. Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, leaning forward just enough to signal attention without pressure. The doctor glanced at him again, then back to Lila. "Your mother came in earlier today," he began, his tone measured, each word placed deliberately. "She was very tired, and the medical team needed to move her to a quieter unit so she could rest and be monitored." Lila listened without blinking, her fingers tightening slightly on the strap of her bag, but her posture remained unchanged. "Is she okay?" she asked softly. The question was simple, but it carried everything she had been holding since the morning. The doctor paused, just briefly, then nodded gently. "She is being taken care of," he said, "but she needs time to recover, and for tonight, she will not be able to have visitors." The words settled into the space between them, not harsh, not abrupt, but firm in a way that could not be misunderstood. Lila's gaze dropped for a fraction of a second, then lifted again. "She told me to wait," she said quietly, almost as if she was clarifying something important. The doctor's expression softened, his voice lowering slightly. "And you did exactly what she asked," he replied. "That was very responsible of you." The acknowledgement did not praise loudly. It recognized something real. Lila's fingers loosened just slightly, but she did not move otherwise. Daniel watched the exchange closely, noting not just what was said, but how it was said, how the doctor chose each word with care, how Lila absorbed them without resistance, as if she had already prepared for answers that might not match her hope. "Will she know I was here?" Lila asked after a moment. The doctor nodded. "Yes," he said. "We will make sure she knows." Another small silence followed, one that felt less uncertain now, but no less heavy. Daniel glanced at the doctor, then back at Lila, then spoke for the first time since the man had arrived. "Is there anything she needs tonight?" he asked. At him, then at the doctor, then down at her bag, her fingers tracing the edge of the zipper once more. The waiting had changed again. Not ended, not resolved, but transformed into something new, something that required her to choose what came next. And for the first time since the hospital doors had closed behind them, the stillness around her was no longer about holding on. It was about deciding where to go from here. The doctor's words lingered in the air long after he stepped away, leaving behind a quiet space filled not with confusion, but with a decision waiting to be made. Lila Brooks sat still, her fingers resting along the edge of her bag, tracing the zipper slowly, as if the motion helped her think. Daniel Whitmore did not rush her. He remained beside her, his posture relaxed but attentive, allowing the silence to exist without filling it. The hospital lights hummed softly overhead, and somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped in a steady rhythm, constant and calm. After a moment, Lila looked up, not at Daniel, but toward the hallway where the doctor had disappeared. "If she wakes up," she said quietly, "she will look for me." The statement was not emotional. It was certain. Daniel nodded once, understanding the weight behind it. "And we will make sure she knows exactly where you are," he replied gently. "So she does not have to worry." Lila's gaze shifted back to her hands. The idea settled slowly, like something new being placed next to something familiar. She adjusted the strap of her bag again, pulling it slightly closer to her chest. "I am not supposed to go far," she added, her voice softer now, not resisting, just explaining. Daniel leaned forward slightly, lowering himself into her line of sight again. "We will stay close," he said. "Close enough that if she asks for you, we can come right back." The words were careful, measured to meet her where she was, not where he wanted her to be. Lila considered that. Her eyes moved briefly to the reception desk, then to the doors, then back to him. The hospital was quiet, but it was not a place for a child to stay through the night. Even she seemed to understand that, even if she had not said it out loud. "Will it be quiet?" she asked after a moment. The question was small, but it carried everything. Daniel's expression softened slightly. "Yes," he said. "Very quiet." Lila nodded once. The decision, when it came, did not arrive dramatically. It came the same way everything about her did, carefully, deliberately, as if she had already practiced how to choose without drawing attention to it. She slid off the chair, standing beside him again, her hand still wrapped around the strap of her bag. Daniel stood with her, not ahead, not behind, but beside. Together, they walked back toward the exit, the nurse offering a small, understanding glance as they passed. Outside, the air felt cooler now, the kind of cold that settled deeper into the night. The car was still waiting, engine idling softly, a quiet constant in a world that had shifted several times already. Lila paused for just a second before getting in, her eyes lifting toward the hospital building, its windows glowing softly against the dark sky. She did not say anything. She did not ask anything. But the look lingered long enough to be understood. Daniel followed her gaze, then spoke quietly. "We will come back in the morning," he said. "First thing." Lila nodded once, then stepped into the car, her movements just as careful as before. This time, she sat slightly closer to the door, her bag held firmly in her lap, but her shoulders no longer held the same rigid stillness as before. The car pulled away from the curb, the hospital slowly fading behind them as the city returned to its quiet rhythm. Streetlights passed one by one, casting brief patterns of light across her face, revealing something subtle, not relief, not yet, but the beginning of it. Daniel watched the reflection in the window, then looked away, his mind already shifting, not to business, not to numbers, but to something far less predictable. Beside him, Lila Brooks remained quiet, but the silence had changed. It was no longer about holding everything in place. It was about allowing something new to begin. And for the first time that night, the space between them did not feel like distance. It felt like the start of something neither of them had planned, but both had chosen anyway. The car moved steadily through the sleeping city, the rhythm of the road soft and uninterrupted, as if the world itself had decided not to interfere with what was unfolding inside. Lila Brooks sat quietly by the window, her reflection faint against the glass, her eyes following the passing lights without really focusing on them. The hospital was gone now, replaced by rows of darkened buildings and the occasional glow of a late-night diner. But her hands remained exactly where they had been, folded carefully over her bag, the strap still wrapped around her fingers like a promise she intended to keep. Daniel Whitmore watched her for a moment, then looked ahead again, his thoughts no longer arranged in neat lines, but shifting, rearranging themselves around something he had not expected to carry into this night. "We are almost there," he said gently after a few minutes, not as an announcement, but as a way of preparing the space ahead. Lila nodded once, her gaze still soft, still steady. The car turned into a quiet drive, the Grand Regent Hotel rising into view once more, its windows glowing warmly against the dark sky, unchanged from when they had left, and yet somehow different now. The driver slowed, pulling up beneath the covered entrance, where soft lighting spilled across the pavement in a welcoming glow. Daniel stepped out first again, then turned back, offering his hand without hesitation this time. Lila took it just as naturally, stepping out with the same careful attention she had shown before, but her shoulders no longer held the same rigid stillness. Together, they walked inside. The lobby, now nearly empty, felt larger in its quiet, the echo of their footsteps more noticeable against the polished floor. The night clerk looked up briefly, recognition flickering across his face, but he said nothing, simply nodding once as they passed. Lila's eyes moved across the space, not searching, not uncertain, but noticing. When they reached the corner she had chosen earlier, she slowed for just a second. The spot was still there, unchanged, the chair, the plant, the narrow space that had held her so completely before. She did not sit. She simply looked at it, then turned back to Daniel. The choice had already been made. "This way," Daniel said quietly, guiding her toward the elevators. The doors opened with a soft chime, and they stepped inside, the mirrored walls reflecting both of them in a way that made the moment feel more real, more defined. Lila stood close to the side, her hands still holding her bag, her eyes lifting briefly to meet her reflection, then lowering again. The elevator moved smoothly upward, each floor marked by a soft light and a quiet pause that did not linger. When the doors opened, the hallway was calm, lined with soft carpet that absorbed their steps, the air warmer, quieter, contained. Daniel led her to a suite at the end of the hall, opening the door with a gentle motion, then stepping aside to let her enter first. Lila paused at the threshold, not because she was unsure, but because she was aware. The room was large, clean, filled with soft light and quiet space, the kind of place where nothing felt out of place. She stepped inside slowly, her sneakers barely making a sound against the carpet. Daniel followed, closing the door behind them with a soft click that seemed to seal the night away from everything outside. "You can stay here tonight," he said, his voice steady, simple, without complication. "It is quiet, and it is safe." Lila stood in the center of the room, her eyes moving across the bed, the chair, the window, taking it in piece by piece. Then, after a moment, she walked to the edge of the room and gently set her bag down on the floor beside the bed, adjusting it carefully, making sure it rested exactly where she wanted it. She did not sit on the bed. Instead, she turned back toward Daniel, her voice soft, but clear. "Can I sit here?" she asked, pointing to a small space near the corner of the room, close to the wall, where the light softened just enough to feel familiar. Daniel looked at the spot, then back at her, understanding immediately. "You can sit anywhere you want," he said. Lila nodded once, then moved to the corner, lowering herself to the floor with the same quiet care she had shown before, her back straight, her hands resting gently in her lap. The room was warm. The space was safe. And yet, she chose the corner. Daniel watched her for a long moment, then turned slightly toward the window, the city lights stretching out beyond the glass. He should have felt relief. He should have felt closure for the night. But instead, something else settled in his chest, something that did not belong to business or routine. Because even here, in a place designed for comfort, a little girl had chosen the smallest space she could find, not because she had to, but because it was the only way she knew how to stay. And as the silence returned, softer now, more contained, Daniel Whitmore realized he was not going to sleep tonight either. The room settled into a quiet that felt different from the lobby, softer, enclosed, the kind of silence that belonged to a place where nothing was expected to happen. But Daniel Whitmore could feel it immediately. This silence was not empty. It was full of something unspoken, something sitting in the corner of the room where Lila Brooks now rested, small and still against the wall, as if the space itself had shaped her into that position. He remained standing near the window for a moment, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the glass, reflections of moving cars sliding like distant currents through the night. He should have changed, should have loosened the rest of his day, but instead he found himself turning back toward her, drawn not by urgency, but by the quiet presence she carried. Lila had not moved since sitting down. Her back was straight, her hands folded gently in her lap, her bag placed beside her within reach, always within reach. The room was warm, but she still held herself as if she were outside, as if comfort was something to be earned, not given. Daniel walked slowly across the room, his footsteps softened by the carpet, and stopped a few feet from her, careful not to close the distance too quickly. "You can use the bed if you want," he said gently, his voice low enough to match the space. Lila looked up at him, her eyes steady, not refusing, not resisting, just considering. "It is okay," she said softly. "I like it here." The answer was familiar now, not about preference, but about control. Daniel nodded once, accepting it, then glanced toward the bed himself, the neatly arranged sheets untouched, the pillows perfectly aligned, waiting for someone who was not going to use them. He pulled a chair slightly closer and sat down this time, not beside her, but angled toward her, lowering himself into the same level of quiet she occupied. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The air remained still, the kind that allowed even the smallest movement to be noticed. Then Lila reached for her bag. It was the first time she had done so since entering the room. She unzipped it carefully, slowly, as if the sound itself mattered, and reached inside. Daniel did not interrupt. He watched as she pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges, creased multiple times, handled often. She held it for a moment before unfolding it on her lap. The light from the lamp caught the surface just enough for Daniel to see faint lines of printed text and handwriting layered across it. Lila looked down at it, her eyes scanning the page in silence. "This is from the hospital," she said quietly, not looking up. "They gave it to my mom." Daniel leaned forward slightly, not to read, but to listen. "What does it say?" he asked gently. Lila traced a line on the paper with her finger, her lips pressing together briefly as she followed the words. "It says she has to stay," she said. And that someone has to make decisions. The last part came softer, almost uncertain, as if she had read it but did not fully understand it. Daniel felt something shift again, deeper this time, more defined. Did they say who? He asked. Lila shook her head slowly. She told me to keep this safe, she replied, and to wait somewhere nice. The instruction repeated itself again, but now it carried more weight, more context, something that extended beyond just waiting. Daniel looked at the paper, then at her, then at the bag resting beside her. Everything she needed to hold on to was in that small space, carried carefully, protected quietly. He leaned back slightly, exhaling in a way that was almost silent. You did exactly what she asked, he said. You kept it safe, and you found somewhere she would not worry about you. Lila looked up at him then, her expression unchanged, but something in her eyes softened just slightly, as if the words had found a place to settle. She folded the paper carefully again, pressing the creases into place with deliberate precision before returning it to her bag. The zipper closed with a soft sound, final but not distant. Then she placed her hands back in her lap, returning to stillness once more. Daniel watched her for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting briefly toward the untouched bed, then back to the corner she had chosen. And in that moment, he understood something that had not been clear before. This was not just a night of waiting. This was a night where a child had been given responsibility far too early and had carried it without asking for anything in return. The room remained quiet, but the silence no longer felt passive. It felt like it was holding something important, something that would not be left the same by morning. The clock on the bedside table read 2:03 a.m., its soft digital glow the only thing marking the passage of time inside the quiet room. Daniel Whitmore had not moved much since Lila folded the paper and placed it back into her bag, but something inside him had shifted, something that refused to settle back into the structured calm he was used to. Across the room, Lila Brooks remained in her corner, her small figure steady against the wall, her breathing slow and even, but her eyes still open, watching nothing and everything at once. She was not asleep. Daniel noticed that immediately. Lila, he said softly, his voice low enough to belong to the hour. You can rest if you want. Lila blinked once, as if returning from a place far away, then looked toward him. I am resting, she replied gently. The answer was not defiant. It was honest. Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning forward slightly in his chair, his elbows resting on his knees. Do you usually stay awake this late? He asked. Lila shook her head. No, sir, she said. But sometimes I have to. The words were simple, but they carried the same quiet weight everything about her did. Daniel nodded, not pressing further, but understanding more than she had explained. The room remained still for a moment, the kind of stillness that allowed thoughts to surface without interruption. Then Lila shifted again, just slightly, reaching for her bag once more. This time, instead of the paper, she pulled out something smaller, a thin bracelet made of colored string, slightly frayed at the edges, its beads uneven but carefully arranged. She held it in her hands for a moment before speaking. My mom made this, she said softly. Daniel watched her fingers move across the bracelet, tracing each bead as if they held something more than decoration. She said it helps you remember things when it feels hard. Lila continued. What kind of things? Daniel asked gently. Lila looked down at it, her voice quieter now, but steady. Important things, she said. Like where to go? And what to do next. The words settled into the room with a clarity that did not need explanation. Daniel leaned back slightly, his gaze moving from the bracelet to her face, then to the corner she had chosen, then back again. Everything about her carried intention. Nothing was random. Not the way she sat, not the way she spoke, not even the things she chose to hold on to. And what does it tell you now? He asked after a moment. Lila was quiet for a few seconds, her fingers still moving along the beads. Then she looked up at him, her eyes steady in a way that felt older than it should have. It says I am doing it right, she said. The answer landed softly, but it stayed. Daniel felt it settle somewhere deeper than logic, somewhere beyond the structured decisions he made every day. He nodded once, slowly. You are, he said. You really are. Lila looked at him for a moment longer, then lowered her gaze again, carefully placing the bracelet back into her bag. She zipped it closed with the same deliberate motion, then rested her hands on top of it once more. The room returned to quiet again, but it had changed. It no longer felt like a place holding uncertainty. It felt like a place holding something steady, something being built quietly without needing to be named. Daniel stood after a moment, walking slowly toward the window again, looking out over the city that never fully slept. But tonight, for the first time in years, he was not thinking about what came next in his world. He was thinking about what came next in hers. Behind him, in the corner she had chosen, Lila Brooks finally leaned her head gently against the wall, her eyes closing not from exhaustion, but from trust, just enough to rest without letting go. And in that quiet moment, Daniel Whitmore understood something that no deal, no contract, no success had ever taught him before. Sometimes, the strongest kind of strength was the kind that asked for nothing and still changed everything. At 5:42 a.m., the first light of morning began to slip quietly through the edges of the curtains, soft and pale, stretching across the carpet in a slow, steady line that reached toward the corner of the room. The city outside was waking, not loudly, but gradually, with distant movement and a faint hum returning to the streets below. Inside, the silence remained, but it had shifted again, no longer heavy with uncertainty, no longer held in place by waiting. It felt lighter now, as if something had settled during the night without needing to be spoken. Daniel Whitmore stood by the window, still in the same clothes from the night before, his posture relaxed but unmoving, his gaze fixed on the horizon as the sky turned from dark to gray. He had not slept, not even for a moment, but he did not feel tired in the way he expected. Behind him, in the corner she had chosen, Lila Brooks stirred slightly, her head still resting gently against the wall, her breathing slow and even. The shift was small, almost unnoticeable, but Daniel turned at the sound, his attention returning to her immediately. She opened her eyes quietly, not startled, not confused, just aware. For a moment, she did not move. Then she straightened slowly, her hands returning to her lap, her posture resetting itself with the same quiet discipline she had carried all night. She looked around the room, taking it in again, as if confirming that it was still the same place, that nothing had changed while she rested. Then her eyes moved to Daniel. "Is it morning?" she asked softly. "Yes," he replied, his voice calm, steady, matching the tone of the light now filling the room. Lila nodded once, then reached for her bag, pulling it slightly closer as if preparing herself for what came next. The movement was familiar now, part of her rhythm, part of how she stayed grounded. "We should go back," she said after a moment. The words were not rushed. They were simply the next step. Daniel walked toward her, stopping a few feet away, giving her space while still remaining present. "We will," he said. "First thing." Lila stood carefully, adjusting the strap of her bag over her shoulder this time, instead of holding it in her lap. The change was small, but it mattered. It meant movement. It meant readiness. Daniel noticed it immediately. He glanced once at the untouched bed, then back at her, understanding without needing to say anything. "Would you like something to eat before we go?" he asked gently. Lila thought for a second, then nodded. "Yes, sir," she said. The answer came easier this time, without hesitation, without calculation. Daniel moved toward the small table, where a tray had been quietly delivered sometime during the early hours, warm breakfast items arranged neatly, untouched until now. He placed a plate closer to her, then stepped back slightly, allowing her to approach it on her own terms. Lila walked over slowly, her steps soft against the carpet, her eyes scanning the tray before selecting a piece of toast. She held it carefully, taking a small bite, the same deliberate pace she had used the night before. But this time, she did not stop after the first bite. She continued, quietly, steadily, as if something inside her had shifted just enough to allow it. Daniel watched without interrupting, his expression thoughtful, his mind already moving ahead, not to meetings or decisions, but to something far more immediate. When she finished, Lila placed the plate back exactly where she had found it, aligning it carefully, then wiped her hands gently on a napkin. She turned back toward him, her eyes steady. "I am ready," she said. Daniel nodded once, reaching for his coat. "Then we will go," he replied. As they walked toward the door, the morning light followed them, stretching across the room, touching the corner she had chosen, the space that had held her through the night. Lila paused for just a second at the doorway, her eyes moving back to that corner one last time. Not because she wanted to stay, but because she remembered it. Then she turned and stepped forward. And as the door closed softly behind them, the room remained quiet, but no longer empty. It held the trace of something that had changed, something that would not be left behind, even as they moved into the light of a new day. The morning air outside St. Mary's Hospital felt different from the night before, clearer, lighter, as if the world had quietly reset itself while no one was looking. The car pulled up to the entrance just after 6:18 a.m., the early shift beginning to move through the doors, nurses with coffee. Cups in hand, footsteps steady, purposeful, alive with a new day. Daniel Whitmore stepped out first, then turned, offering his hand as he had done before. Lila Brooks took it without hesitation, her grip still light, but certain now, as if the decision she had made the night before still held steady in the morning light. Together, they walked inside. The hospital felt more awake now, voices a little louder, movement more frequent, but the quiet spaces still remained between it all. Lila's eyes moved across the room again, but this time, there was less searching, less uncertainty. She knew why she was here. At the reception desk, the same nurse looked up, recognition crossing her face immediately. "Good morning," she said gently. "You came back early." Lila nodded once. "Yes, ma'am," she replied. The nurse smiled softly, then glanced toward the hallway. "Let me check if the doctor is available," she said, already reaching for the phone. The waiting did not feel the same this time. Lila stood beside Daniel, her bag resting against her side, her posture steady but no longer rigid. She was not holding herself in place anymore. She was standing in it. After a moment, the same doctor from the night before appeared, his expression calm, but warmer now, as if the morning had softened something even for him. He approached them with measured steps, then stopped in front of Lila, lowering his voice slightly. "Good morning," he said. "She asked about you." The words landed immediately. Lila's fingers tightened slightly on the strap of her bag, her eyes lifting just a little more than before. "Can I see her?" she asked. The doctor nodded gently. "For a few minutes," he said. "She is awake now." Lila did not rush forward. She nodded once, then looked briefly at Daniel, not asking permission, but acknowledging that he was still there. He nodded back, his expression steady. "I will be right here," he said. Lila followed the doctor down the hallway, her steps quiet but purposeful, her small figure moving through the space with a kind of clarity that had not been there the night before. Daniel remained where he was, watching until she turned the corner and disappeared from view. The hallway felt longer without her. The seconds stretched, but they did not feel uncertain. They felt like part of something necessary. After a few minutes, the doctor returned, but this time, he was not alone. Lila walked beside him, her hand now gently holding another hand, smaller than an adult's strength, but steady enough to matter. Monica Brooks moved slowly, supported by a nurse, her face tired but present, her eyes finding Lila first before anything else. They did not speak immediately. They did not need to. Lila stepped closer, her small hand still holding her mother's, her posture no longer rigid, no longer bracing, but simply there. "I waited," she said softly. Monica's expression shifted, something deep and quiet passing through her eyes, something that did not need to be explained. "I know," she replied gently. Daniel stood a few feet away, watching the moment unfold without stepping into it, without interrupting it. He had seen negotiations, decisions, outcomes that changed entire industries, but nothing like this. Nothing that carried this kind of quiet weight. The doctor glanced toward him briefly, then back at the two in front of him, as if recognizing something that did not belong to charts or schedules. Lila reached into her bag then, pulling out the folded paper and the small bracelet, holding them carefully before placing them in her mother's hand. "I kept them safe," she said. Monica looked down at them, then back at her daughter, her fingers closing gently around both. "You always do," she replied. The words were soft, but they carried everything. And in that moment, standing in the quiet space between night and morning, Daniel Whitmore understood something with absolute clarity. The girl who had asked to sit in the corner had never been invisible. She had been holding something together, something stronger than anything he had built in his entire life. And now, as the light of the new day filled the hallway, that quiet strength was no longer hidden. It was seen.